AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO. We are a program of recorded interviews with former U.S. intelligence officers and those who write about them. And today, I'm very pleased to welcome back the author, lecturer, and former foreign correspondent, Douglas Waller, to the show. He has a BA in English from Wake Forest University and an MA in Urban Administration from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. For a number of years, he covered foreign affairs as a diplomatic correspondent for both Time magazine and Newsweek, reporting primarily on major military conflicts. He has a series of books, mostly on intelligence and national security, and he has a brand new book out entitled The Determined Spy, the story of the life and career of former OSS and early CIA officer Frank Wisner. Doug, welcome to AFIO Now.
Oh, it's good to be here.
Doug, tell our office a little bit about the early life of Frank Wisner before World War II.
Well, he was the son of the South. His father was a prominent lumberman in Laurel, Mississippi, which is southeast of Jackson. He was a bright kid, but academically uneven as a student in grade school. His father had to lobby to get him into the University of Virginia. When he got there, though, he excelled as a track star, went to UVA Law School, and earned top honors, graduated with top honors, became one of their distinguished alumni. From there, he made his way to New York City, where he joined a venerable Wall Street firm, one of whose young attorneys at one point had been Franklin Roosevelt. That's also where Frank Wisner met his wife, Polly Knowles, who was the daughter of a New York businessman, a very accomplished woman in her own right. Wisner soon was handling important cases for his law firm, but just as soon he was becoming bored to tears with law work, not really interested in it. He visited Germany in 1938, could clearly see that Hitler was on the rise there and bent on world domination. And he came back and decided he wanted to get in early on what he envisioned would be the second global conflict in the world, which of course was World War II. So 6 months before the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Wisner signed on as a lieutenant junior grade in the U.S. Navy, Naval Reserve. It turned out, though, he became just as bored in his Navy job. He was stuck at an intelligence unit in New York City, basically pushing paper and clipping clips. He said he joked with one of his kids one time that he was in command of a cutter, but the cutter was a pair of scissors. Then he heard about this organization, mysterious organization called the Office of Strategic Services, being run by William Wild Bill Donovan. Wisner actually knew Donovan, had socialized with him in New York from time to time, and Donovan was heading up this OSS unit to give Franklin Roosevelt an overseas spy force, which Roosevelt didn't have, and in fact it made Roosevelt physically ill at times, that he didn't know what was really going on overseas, and he was making these tremendous decisions at the time, like Lend-Lease aid for Great Britain, and not really knowing what lay ahead of him. It was interesting. White House aides in Roosevelt's White House were all scratching their head. Why in the world is Roosevelt hiring a prominent New York Republican, which is what Donovan was? He ran for governor in 1932 to replace Roosevelt. He lost that election, but Roosevelt and Donovan said some pretty mean things to each other during the campaign. At one point, Donovan accused Roosevelt of being a Hyde Park faker. Now, it sounds pretty mild today by today's standards, but back then those were fighting words. But Donovan was part of the internationalist wing of the Republican Party. He too saw that the United States needed to prepare for war and needed an overseas intelligence service.
Once he joined OSS with Donovan, what kind of assignments was Frank Wisner given overseas?
Well, he got 2 years of 2 weeks of spy training at a camp out in Maryland, near Towson, Maryland, which didn't much, and it really didn't qualify him to be a spy. But his trainers there observed that Wisner was a guy who could think on his feet. He was very level-headed, and they were very impressed with him. So they decided to send him with just 2 weeks under his training under his belt to Cairo to improve the intelligence output of the station in Cairo, which was managing intelligence operations in the Middle East, the Balkans, and Southeast Europe. Keep in mind, there were hundreds of intelligence reports pouring into the Cairo station, but you needed some mechanism to analyze all those reports, and more importantly, to get that information to the right people who needed that information. Wisner did a remarkable job of putting together and overseeing the output of intelligence and really improved the operation in Cairo. He was also pretty savvy in the games, bureaucratic games you had to play in that kind of position. One time, there was this stuffed shirt admiral that Donovan sent over on an inspection tour, and he landed in Cairo breathing fire, ready to rip apart that station. And Wisner and his men talked the admiral into going out with them to Madame Badia's nightclub, where they filled him with cheap martinis and put him in the loving arms of a belly dancer. The next morning, the admiral got up. He was sleeping on Wisner's dining room table. He had no recollection of what happened the night before, but he figured it was not good. And to keep Wisner from blabbing what had happened, he gave the Cairo station a glowing report on its operations.
But Cairo wasn't his only assignment during World War II. Where else did he go?
No, it wasn't. He moved from Cairo to a position he really didn't want, and that was in Istanbul, Turkey, where Donovan had put in place a old Republican pal who was Illinois Savings and Loan executive. His name was Lanning Packy McFarland, and McFarland was a big talker. His mission was to organize operations into Eastern Europe and the Balkans, but he was hopelessly out of his element. And in no time, Nazi and Axis spy services had rolled up his operation and totally infiltrated it. Packy McFarland was also notoriously lax about insurance. The first time Wisner met him was in an Istanbul nightclub. He was sitting there at the table waiting for Packy to show up, and all of a sudden the lights turned on and the stage came to life and curtains unfolded, and out came a line of Turkish chorus girls, and in the middle of that line was Packy McFarland, dressed in drag, singing "Boo Boo Baby, I'm a Spy." I'm not making this up. It really happened. It took Wisner several months to clean up the Istanbul operation. And by then, he was starting to gain a reputation in OSS circles as a fixer, a guy who could move into a troubled operation and overhaul it. Soon after he had overhauled the Istanbul operation, he talked Donovan into letting him go on the offensive in Romania. Romania at that time could see that the Germans were losing the war, and they had been allies with the Germans. And so they wanted to switch sides and join the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States. The king of Romania ordered his army to point their guns not at the Soviet troops coming in, but at the Germans leaving. Wisner flew in fact, he flew in a hijacked Luftwaffe plane that a Romanian pilot had commandeered. He flew in from Istanbul to Bucharest with just a radio in his suitcase. Didn't even have his real uniform at that point, and organized a intelligence operation that, they literally gathered up 1 ton of Nazi documents that the Germans left behind. They retrieved American pilots, Allied pilots that had been shot down. And most importantly, they began spying on the Red Army that came in. Of course, the Red Army, which was soon could figure out or sniff out what Wisner's people were up to, and they put the squeeze on the growing American delegation to shrink his organization and get it out of Bucharest. Say Wisner eventually left the country deeply embittered over the way the Russians were treating the Romanians.
So the war comes to an end, and Wisner returns to the United States. What was the first job he took with the U.S. government, and how did he end up at the new organization called the CIA?
When Wisner got back, this is started back in law work in January 1946. He quickly became just as bored then as he had been before. And he had kept in touch with a lot of his intelligence buddies from the war, guys like Alan Dulles, who had headed up the Burns, Switzerland station, and even Donovan, too, who had regular meetings with some of his old comrades. Eventually, Wisner managed to land himself a position as head of an organization with a very bland-sounding name. It was called the Office of Policy Coordination, but it had a hugely important mission in the covert world. Basically, they wanted, this is the Truman White House, tasked Wisner with organizing propaganda, psy-war, infiltration, sabotage, espionage operations against the Russians, in many cases adopting the same kind of dirty tactics as the Russians did, which Wisner set about doing. By 1952, Wisner had a total of some 6,000 operatives working in his organization. These were saboteurs, spies, propagandists, contract workers who were scattered all over the world. I mean, just imagine from 6,000 men and women working in this operation. That's the equivalent of a brigade, an army brigade worth of covert operatives. So it was a major undertaking on his side. I mean, that he put together very, very quickly.
And then what led him to the CIA?
Well, the CIA, it's interesting. His Office of Policy Coordination was kind of a bureaucratic anomaly. It worked really outside the control of the CIA. Admiral Roscoe Hillenkotter, at that point, was the CIA director and really didn't want any part of covert operations type of work. And so Wisner really worked for the State Department and the Pentagon. If he answered to anybody, to them. But it was a situation where he couldn't stay independent for too long. And eventually, after the CIA was created in 1947, and Walter Beadle Smith took over the agency, he ordered Wisner's operation to be folded into the CIA at that point, and Beadle Smith put a firm hand on what Wisner was doing. And Wisner realized that. He knew he couldn't work outside the agency for too long.
Describe for our audience the CIA plot to remove Mossadegh from power in Iran and bring the Shah back to the throne.
This was it was actually one of two operations that were hugely successful for Wisner. In 1953, and you have to go back, there was a shift in the direction of these covert operations under Eisenhower, with John Foster Dulles at State and Alan Dulles at CIA, and Wisner operating under Dulles, heading up his clandestine service. The Eisenhower administration realized that the CIA operations in Europe had not been all that successful. They had what I call a batting average, a few hits, but there are also a lot of strikeouts too. The Eisenhower administration instead wanted to redirect the CIA's covert operations toward Southeast Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. And in the Middle East, one of the targets that they soon landed on was Iran and Mohammad Mossadegh, who was the Democratic elected prime minister of Iran. But Mossadegh pissed off a few important groups of people. Number one, his military establishment in his country, which backed the Shah of Iran. Number two, the British, who did not appreciate Mossadegh nationalizing the oil production capabilities and taking it over. And the Dulles brothers and Frank Wisner, who saw the Soviets to the north, feared that they were at the doorstep there ready to take over this unstable country. So they sent in Kermit Roosevelt, who was a grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, who helped with the organization of a coup that got rid of Mossadegh, who was kind of an oddball himself. I mean, he liked to at times pretend he was fainting. At other times, he would hold official government meetings in his bedroom wearing his gray pajamas. And this was somebody that they decided they had to get rid of. That his cardinal sin was being a neutral in terms of the Cold War. They're favoring the West or the East in the operation, so that the Shah took over with Kermit Roosevelt's help, and it turned out to have long-term implications for us. The Shah became a tyrant who was eventually overthrown by Islamic fundamentalists who turned Iran, as we all know, into a base camp for terrorists.
And I understand someone to whom you may be related who also played a pivotal role in that operation.
Yeah, it was John Waller, who was, I thought, in running across the documents I reviewed, and I reviewed thousands of pages of documents, he was kind of the intellectual force behind the CIA's role in the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran. And he really didn't get much credit for it back then. Kermit Roosevelt got a lot of credit because he wrote a book about it. But Waller was the one who, particularly Frank Wisner, relied quite a bit on putting together the organizational structure, the theoretical structure for the overthrow. Now, he and I share the same last name, and we're probably related in one way or the other. And I can remember when I worked for Newsweek magazine, and John Waller, I think, had left then and was with AFIO, or he had been IG of the CIA. And I remember trying to play the Waller card there and see if he would open up to me. And he said, no, that's not going to work.
So I told Doug off camera that John Waller was also an OSS officer who served in Istanbul. And when I joined CIA's Near East and South Asia Division, John Waller was my first division chief. And I'm also very happy to say was an AFIO president. Doug, tell us about Guatemala and United Fruit and the CIA plot there to remove an incumbent president.
Yeah, Guatemala was the second big win at the time for Wisner and the Eisenhower administration. 1954, President Jacobo Arbenz was the 37-year-old president of Guatemala, who was a neutral, was an economic reformer, had no interest in kowtowing or cultivating the Americans. And the Eisenhower administration eventually decided he had to go. Keep in mind, in the Eisenhower administration's mind, if you were a neutral, you were an enemy. You either had to be for the U.S. or against it. There were no in-betweeners allowed back then. And so they organized with Wisner, this time assuming much more direct control of the operation, a coup to oust Arbenz in Guatemala, which again had tragic results because the military generals who succeeded Arbenz over the next few decades, their regimes were very brutal. Some 200,000 Guatemalan peasants were killed by death squads. 40,000 were disappeared. But back in 1954, Eisenhower was delighted with the results in Guatemala because here he was able to topple a regime and set back what he thought was Moscow entry into the region without having to send in the Marines or tanks and everything. Because keep in mind, these coups were incredibly cheap. They didn't cost them much money for it, and they were certainly a lot less expensive than the U.S. military forces.
When was Frank Wisner's first episode, and how did it manifest itself?
We're talking all the way into the 1950s, the mid-1950s, when Wisner started showing symptoms of bipolar disorder. Back then it was called manic depression because it combined, and it was actually an accurate term for it, it combined mania's intense frenzy with the kind of oppressive nature of depression. Very, very cruel disease. Now, how he contracted it, nobody really knows. Perhaps it was genetically inherited. His mother was believed by the family to have suffered from depression, although it was never diagnosed in her. Wisner, as a little kid, was very hyperactive, but that could be passed off just being a busy kid. People in World War II, comrades in World War II, thought, that his obsession with the Russians and his hatred of the Russians were a symptom of this disease. But Wisner had an awful lot to hate in the Russians in their takeover of Eastern Europe. When he got to Washington, Wisner at first exhibited symptoms of what psychiatrists call hypomania, which is where you have your excess energy and charisma, and you're able to work long hours and put things together, be a high flyer. But in political Washington, that describes the upper reaches of the government there. What happened in the mid 1950s was Wisner started losing his cool more. He started lashing out in meetings, complaining about having to oversee so many operations. Of course, he was the one who set up these operations. And, being antagonistic and critical of colleagues and friends. He also started drinking more heavily and smoking more, which are symptoms of bipolar disorder. But again, people in the city thought, well, that's, just Wisner's under a lot of pressure. He's in a pressure cooker job. Frank was just blowing off steam. At the late fall of 1956, Wisner was overseas when the bipolar disorder gene inside him literally detonated. He was there when two crises erupted. Number one, the Soviet tanks moving in to crush the rebellion in Hungary. And number two, British and French forces, with the help of the Israelis, landing and taking over the Suez Canal, which President Nasser had nationalized. Wisner spent all that time touring around his stations in Europe in a frenzy. He was meeting with people every hour of the day, literally till 5 a.m. in the morning. He filed incoherent dispatches back to Washington that nobody could understand. He vented to other officers. They could see, or they feared that he was suffering from a nervous breakdown in Europe. It all finally kind of came to the head when he was in Rome, having dinner with Claire Booth Luce, who's the ambassador the U.S. ambassador in Rome. And Bill Colby, who was the top CIA officer, noticed that Wisner was just becoming completely unhinged, at some points even breaking down and crying in front of Ambassador Luce. So, I mean, this was really the spark that really set it off for him.
Once Wisner got back home to the States, where was he hospitalized and then ultimately committed? And what was the only treatment available for bipolar disease back in those days?
When he got back, he'd have good months and then bad months or bad weeks. It was a disease that hibernated for a while and then came back. Finally, in late 1958, when the disease was becoming too much for his wife, Polly, and he was literally in danger of dying from the symptoms that were so pronounced, that Polly and Wisner's good friends talked him into going to the Shepard Pratt Institute near Baltimore, which was a very innovative and had a national reputation as a mental institution. And Wisner stayed there for 172 days. He underwent electroconvulsive therapy, which is ECT or shock therapy, which actually helped quite a bit. I mean, there was this kind of misconception about shock therapy that it was something painful. Everybody's watched the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where Jack Nicholson, supposedly gets zapped by shock therapy, and it's torture. It really isn't. Wisner was put to sleep, so he never felt a thing. And he thought the shock therapy actually did some good for him. The problem with that kind of treatment is it's not long lasting. It's more a short-term cure, and it's still used to this day. There were no bipolar disorder drugs on the market at that point. There wouldn't be for another 5 or 6 years, actually even longer than that, 6 or 7 years, like lithium, which is still effective to this day. So that in Wisner's case, it would help him out for a while, but not forever.
Once Wisner was released from Shepard Pratt, what kind of jobs was he offered?
Well, it's interesting. The agency considered mental illness a battle casualty among its operatives, its officers. So it had actually a very enlightened view that it set out to get the officer treated and then get him back to work without being stigmatized. In Wisner's case, Allen Dulles realized he couldn't put him back as head of the clandestine service in that kind of high pressure job. So they found for him what actually became a somewhat perfect assignment, which was chief of station in the London station, where he was there from 1959 to early 1962. And again, did fairly well there. He was more kind of an ambassador for the agency overseas. We weren't doing any spying on the British to speak of. And he did well, except the bipolar disorder the symptoms came back toward the end. And he was being given shock therapy by British psychiatrists to try and relieve some of the symptoms. John McCone, who by that point was a CIA director, actually was horrified when he learned that British psychiatrists were treating an American, top, former clandestine service chief. So he ordered Wisner to come back, to return. He stuck around for a while, but by 1962, eventually retired from the CIA and went into basically as a business as a private consultant.
And tell us a bit about Wisner's final days.
He, in fall 1965, he had planned a hunting trip in Spain, really looking forward to it. He'd been on those trips before and had gotten all the way to Europe, and another episode of the bipolar disorder struck him, and they had to come home. His wife, Polly, to back up Wisner, one of his outside pursuits was a 369-acre farm he owned in Maryland that he went to on the weekends. His wife, Polly, had the farm manager take away and hide what she thought were all the weapons, shotguns and other weapons they used for bird hunting, from the farm. But he got there, and on October 29, 1965, he managed to locate one double-barreled shotgun on the second floor of the farmhouse and pointed it at his right temple and fired it, killing himself instantly. He was 56 years old then, and it was really a tragic ending for one of the CIA's true pioneers.
So, Doug, you spent a lot of time studying Frank Wisner. What would you say his legacy was?
Well, he was the founding father of the CIA's clandestine service. He was there from the beginning. I've told audiences that we are now in the second Cold War with the Russians. Wisner was in on the first Cold War more than 70 years ago. He basically pioneered the U.S. government's introduction into secret political warfare. He was also a pioneer in terms of liaison relationships with other foreign intelligence services. He did a lot of the early work on that, and so he was one of the modern, at that time, the modern day innovators for the agency. Again, he had operations that succeeded. He had operations that didn't succeed. A lot of the ones that didn't succeed were because he had to rush in with operatives. He was being pressured by the State Department and the Pentagon to move quickly. And so it was a lot of trial by error learning at that point.
Well, the name of the book is The Determined Spy. It is very well researched and well told. And I want to thank Doug Waller for a great interview.
Good talking to you.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit afio.com.